Well, as a newer guy on staff, I've been asked several times over the last few months to put fresh eyes on something. And the conversation usually is like, hey, Cory, we want to invite you into this meeting about food trucks and fireworks. Can you put fresh eyes on it? And the idea is that if you spend any amount of time in an organization, you become sort of immune or blind to things that are either inefficient or broken or just plain strange. And the reality is there's stuff like that that's all around us all the time, that when we are in something for a long time, strange things become normal. Been married for 13 years. Praise God that the strange things about me have become normal to my wife, okay? But I wanted to put fresh eyes on some things in our life that I think are just plain strange that have lost their strangeness. So you ready to see some strange things with me? All right, here we go. We're going to start with this one, clapping. You ever thought about this? Basically saying, yes, I repeatedly slap the ends of my arms at you in approval. That's what clapping is at the end of the day. Thank you, that's right. All right, how about the IRS? This one gets me. IRS basically says, how about you just guess how much money you owe me, and I'll tell you in a year how wrong you are. It's got to be a better way than that. How about teeth? Love this. Teeth. This is so strange. The only part of your skeleton that you can see, it's on the outside of your body, that also just falls out early in life and then grows back, but just once. That's weird, okay? How about earrings? This is us basically looking at a part of our body and saying, yes, I'm gonna drill a hole in you and hang something from you to make you prettier. We don't do that with anything else, but earrings it is. Okay, here's a really important one. Pastors who are afraid to admit that they love Nickelback. Can we just say, that's weird, like just admit it, right? We should affirm Ian and his love. All right, one more. Balloons, us showing up and saying, congratulations, here is a sack of breath. All very strange things. Strange things. We are diving into a brand new teaching series out of the book of Jonah. It's 4 chapters. We're going to spend 4 weeks in Jonah. And Jonah is so weird for so many reasons. And a man getting swallowed by a fish is just, it doesn't even make the top 3 reasons why this book is very strange. I'd be curious to just show of hands, how many of you, whether you grew up in church or not, know the story of Jonah? I've heard of it, know something about the story of Jonah? Right, the vast majority of it. That's so interesting that despite the fact that you may have never picked up a Bible, you know this story, or at least you think you do, okay? The idea behind the book of Jonah and studying it is I want us to put fresh eyes on it. I want us to see this book in all of its strangeness, and it is so strange. And I think that it's actually precisely in its strangeness that it becomes a book of good news for us. So while we're at it, we should probably address the whale in the room, okay? You may be wondering, is this story true? And it's a valid question because it is quite remarkable. We don't see human life, humans swallowed up by fish and surviving every day. Although there was a news article like a couple years ago that was this actually happened to a guy. But it's remarkable nonetheless. You may be wondering, should we buy into this as history, or is this more like allegory, parable? There are certain parts of the Bible that are not meant to be taken literally. Many of Jesus' parables are like this. We don't really care if there was a guy scattering seed on different kinds of soil. That wasn't necessarily a historical fact. It was designed to teach a lesson. So how about the book of Jonah? How about the book of Jonah? I want to say at the start, if you are somebody who's not a follower of Jesus in the room, I want to let you off the hook, no pun intended, right away, okay? We have no expectation that if you're not a follower of Jesus, that you would come and we'd open up an old book and tell a story and that you would buy in, okay? So you're off the hook. You can just sit back and relax and take in the story of Jonah and see if it speaks to your heart in some way. For those of us who are followers of Jesus, here is what I would say. If you believe that Jesus Christ physically resurrected from the dead and lives here and now today, then a man getting swallowed by a fish is sort of small potatoes. All right? The second thing I would say is that this book doesn't ring like allegory or fantasy. It has concrete historical details, geography, dates, names. These are not the kinds of things that you would expect to hear in an allegory, which tends to be sort of exists in a vacuum, boy who cried wolf kind of things. And what you might expect to get the front row seat of a fantastical book like this that was an allegory is that they would make a big deal out of the giant fish that swallowed the guy. The fish, out of 4 chapters, gets all of 2 short verses. Okay? So it just doesn't ring like allegory. Third thing I'd say is that Jesus refers to this story, and when he does, he seems to take it as historical fact. So, here at the Bridge, so do we. Okay? So we're going to buy in with a way out, okay? Even if you're not fully bought in, I think it's going to speak to you anyway, but I think it actually happened. I think it speaks to us today, even in all of its strangeness. So, the book of Jonah, here's the kind of the governing question for all 4 chapters. The book asks us this: who is beyond the bounds of God's grace? Who is beyond the bounds of God's grace? We're going to be diving into chapter 1 today. If you've got a Bible, you can turn or swipe there. And chapter 1 basically has 3 things happening: a strange assignment, a strange storm, and a strange solution. It's all strange, and we're going there, okay? So, a strange assignment. Chapter 1, verse 1. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. All right, so a strange assignment. It's strange for 3 reasons. The first reason it's strange is the place where God is sending Jonah. It's Nineveh. Now, this story takes place in about 760 BC, okay? Nineveh was a major city in the empire of Assyria. It was a superpower of the day. It held all of the military and political power available. It conquered all of sort of the known world. And they were willing to do anything and everything to take hold of and keep this power. And one of their tactics was to use psychological terrorism, psychological warfare. So when they would enter a city of a military opponent, they would skin victims alive. They would tear off parts of their body. They would impale bodies on poles publicly for everybody around to see. They were willing to do anything and everything to make their message clear. They were all about brutality. They were all about making themselves the most powerful. And it's quite possible that Jonah himself would have witnessed some of this, as Assyria, they were northeast, bordered the nation of Israel to the northeast, would occasionally swoop down and do some of these things in Israel itself. And the story starts with God showing up to Jonah and saying, go to Nineveh, preach against it, for its wickedness has come up before me. Now, at first blush, you might think that this would be welcome news for Jonah, because this would mean that Assyria's days are numbered, right? God is finally taking notice of their wickedness, and he says, no more. I'm bringing the hammer of justice down on Assyria. But before we get too far, we have to stop and ask, how is it that prophets, which is Jonah's a prophet, how do prophets function in the Bible? See, if God wanted to just smite Assyria, he could do it, right? Then and there. So why send a guy? And as we begin to think about it, we think you send a guy to preach about somebody's wickedness in order to warn them. This is a warning shot. And what we know about warnings is that they are not something that is violent. They are something that is designed to produce change in the person that you are warning, right? So when Jonah is going to send a word of warning, here's what we realize. A warning is not an act of hatred on God's part. A warning is actually an act of God's patience. God is responding to Assyria's wickedness not with a hammer of justice, but rather with a chance to change. And that's strange to Jonah. In fact, it's offensively strange. The second reason this assignment is strange is because God is sending Jonah. It says, go to Nineveh. Now, prophets in the Old Testament, God used them all the time to communicate messages to his people. Most of the messages were to Judah and Israel, God's own people. Occasionally, God would use a prophet to speak to a neighboring nation. Never, so far as we can tell, has God told a prophet to leave his homeland and go outside to a neighboring nation to preach there. So far as we can tell, Jonah is the only one who fits that category. The third reason this mission and assignment is strange is the man God chose, Jonah. Now, Jonah appears in exactly one other time in the Old Testament. It's 2 Kings chapter 14. And what we learn about Jonah in that passage sheds a lot of light on the book of Jonah. He prophesied during the reign of King Jeroboam II. And King Jeroboam II, his rule was characterized by military might, economic total imbalance. He worshiped foreign gods, told his people to go worship foreign gods. He was completely unfit as a king of Israel to rule. And God sent prophets to go speak against King Jeroboam, Hosea and Amos. You can go read what they said to him. But not Jonah. Jonah speaks a word of prosperity over Jeroboam II. He says, yay. He's like holding his pom-poms. Go, King Jeroboam. He's saying, you go expand. You increase your economic prosperity, even though people in your own home country are starving. Tim Keller, who is, he just passed away, one of my favorite authors and pastors. He wrote a book, wonderful book, called The Prodigal Prophet, about the book of Jonah. Highly recommend. But he says this about who God selected for this mission. The original readers of the book of Jonah would have remembered him as immensely patriotic, a highly partisan nationalist. And they would have been amazed that God would send a man like that to preach to the very people he most feared and hated. See, if God was going to send somebody, he had other choices. Hosea, Amos, but he doesn't send them. He sends this guy, Jonah. And for Jonah, it added up to this. God, you've got the wrong guy for the wrong assignment for the wrong people. It's all just wrong. So what does Jonah do? He runs. He sets off for Tarshish. Now, Tarshish, scholars estimate, is a port city off of modern-day Spain. This is now roughly 2,500 miles in the exact opposite direction that God is calling Jonah to go. Now, to put some context in that would be like if God showed up to me and said, Cory, I want you to go to Washington, D.C., and I took off on a bus for Seattle, okay? Just to the edge of the known world. But here's what strikes me about this text. It doesn't say that Jonah ran away from Assyria. That would be very understandable, right? Think about it. Jonah he's a Hebrew from the relatively small nation of Israel, and God is sending him to go preach to the world's superpower at the time and call it wicked. Now, Tim Keller likens this to a Jewish rabbi standing on the streets of Berlin in 1941 and calling out Nazi Germany for their wickedness. How do we think it would go for that rabbi? Probably not well. So our first thought in reading Jonah and his response is, he's concerned that Assyria is not going to listen to him, right? In fact, this is a dangerous mission. They might even kill him. But that's not what the text says. It doesn't say he ran from Assyria. It says twice in verse 3, he ran away from the Lord. Why? Chapter 1 does not answer that question. Something Jonah says in chapter 4 does. So we're going to fast forward real quick. Chapter 4, Jonah says this to God. It says, that is why I tried to forestall by fleeing to Tarshish. Catch this. I knew you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. See, so Jonah is not worried that the people of Nineveh won't listen to him. It seems that he's worried that they might listen to him. Jonah isn't worried that his enemies will turn on him. He's worried that his enemies will turn to God. He's not afraid that he's going to die. He's afraid his enemies might live. And Jonah will have none of it. So he runs away from God. Right off the bat, here is what the book of Jonah is teaching us. When our hope for sinners punished surpasses the joy that we have over sinners redeemed, we've missed the heart of God. We've missed it. This is why grace is scandalous, friends. The thing about Jonah, though, if you remember, he's not opposed to grace, right? King Jeroboam II, wickedness, deserves death, all the rest. Happy to preach grace then, isn't he? Happy to preach grace when it's to me and my kind of people, but with my enemies, not so fast. So who is that for you? Might ask it this way, who's your Assyria? Who, if you're honest, are you hoping gets punished and not redeemed? Maybe to put a finer point on it, who do you hope to never see in heaven? Is it an ex? Is it somebody that you've done business with? Is it somebody who's betrayed you? Is it somebody who you might see in the news somewhat frequently? Is it those stupid people who have the gall to vote that way or for that person? Who is your Assyria? Who, if they were forgiven by God, would not just make you confused, but actually make you angry? Going to Nineveh did not make sense to Jonah, and so he doesn't go. He doesn't obey. He picks up and runs. And as the text says, he's not running just from the assignment, he's running from God himself. So the question that faces Jonah is a question that still faces every single one of us today, and that is this. Am I willing to obey God even when it doesn't make sense? Am I? How does that question sit with you today? Do you know that God is calling you to an assignment or maybe a step of obedience? You know it, and you just are resisting. Even if it doesn't make sense, even if it seems strange, are you resisting? And maybe God is saying, hey, it's time to come clean about what you've done. And already the objections start coming, don't they? But if I do that, I could lose my job. If I did that, that might be the end of my marriage. Is God calling you to extend a hand of friendship to somebody who's prickly or needy or just lonely? And you're thinking, that's not really how I want to spend my free time, thanks. Is God calling you to maybe stop sleeping with somebody that you're sleeping with? And your instinct is, well, if I do that, they might think I don't love them anymore. Is God calling you maybe to be more financially generous, step out in generosity? And you're thinking, well, if I do that, then the math doesn't add up to have the retirement that I had set my sights on. Maybe God is calling you to extend a hand of forgiveness to somebody who has hurt you, maybe badly. And your thought is, if I don't make sure that they are punished, then maybe they'll just get away with what they've done, and I can't have that. Is there something that you know that God is asking of you, a step of obedience to walk in? Are you resisting? Jonah thought he had God figured out. He sort of put God in this little box, and God broke out. God broke the mold. He did something strange, and instead of obeying, Jonah gets on a boat to run. And that leads us to part 2 of our story, a strange storm. Verse 4, then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. All the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God, and they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. The captain went to him and said, how can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he'll take notice of us so that we will not perish. And the sailors said to each other, come, let us cast lots to find out who's responsible for this calamity. Casting lots, if you don't know, is sort of an ancient version of rolling dice or drawing straws. And it was assumed that this is how you could discern the divine will. Okay? So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. So they asked him, tell us, who is responsible for making all this trouble for us? What kind of work do you do? Where do you come from? What's your country? From what people are you? And he answered, I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. I love this, by the way. He's like, yes, my God makes the sea and the dry land, holds the oceans in his palm, and I'm on a boat running away from him. None of it makes sense, right? Sin is not logical. 10, this terrified them, and they asked, what have you done? See, they knew he was running away from the Lord because he had already told them so. The storm is strange. How do we know? These sailors are caught up in it. These are experienced men of the sea. They've been through a storm or two. And yet when this storm comes, their first reaction is not, wow, what an act of nature, but rather, what an act of God. And they start praying, and they start casting lots, because they're trying to find out who is responsible. Who? Why? These sailors, even though they were pagan sailors, they didn't worship the God of Israel. They had this instinct. They instinctively knew something to be true that all of us, on some level, know to be true, which is this, that the path away from God is often the path into a storm. Now, to be really clear, it's a word of caveat. Sometimes we experience storms in life just because we live in a broken world. Some of you are in storms today that are not of your own making. They have nothing to do with your obedience or disobedience. Sometimes we just get caught up in a storm. Jesus, when he was asked why a particular man was born blind, right? The people would say, why is he blind? Was it his parents' sin or his sin? Which one was it that caused this? You remember Jesus' response? You know the story? He said, neither. Some forms of brokenness, some storms happen just because we are living in a warped version of the good world God created, all right? But verse 4 says this is not one of those kinds of storms. This is a storm that God sent, it says. And often, some of you know this, God sends storms because they have a way of getting our attention, don't they? Sometimes God sends a storm to soften our hearts and open our eyes to the ways in which we have been turning from, walking away from, sometimes running away from him, and to remind us it's time to come back. Now, there are two ways to respond to a storm of discipline. There is to humbly acknowledge what you've been doing and to turn to God. And then there's just to dig in your heels, to double down on what you're doing. So what do we see as a response here in the story? It's actually both, but in a way that's not the way that we'd expect. The storm comes after Jonah, but it's actually the sailors on the boat who are responding in humility. It's the sailors who are crying out to their gods. They recognize that they are helpless. They begin throwing cargo over the ship to try to keep the ship afloat. And when those things don't work, they turn to Jonah and they say, maybe your God can help us. Cry out to him. They're trying to do whatever it takes to act in obedience. They're responding humbly to the storm. And where's Jonah? He is sleeping below deck. We're told that the storm, catch this, was so bad that the ship threatened to break up, and Jonah is taking a cat nap. How wild is that? And the captain of the ship, he comes and finds him, and he asks the question, the very same question that any of us would ask. How can you sleep through all of this, right? A few years ago, this is when my wife and I were still living in the Chicago area. It's the middle of the night, and we're both sleeping, and suddenly, my wife is shaking me awake, and she says, Cory, someone is in the house. And in the past, she has shaken me awake and be like, did you hear that? Or, I think I heard something. Will you go check it out? Something like that. No, she's certain. Someone is in the house. And so I jump up out of bed. My heart's throbbing. I thought I was way more prepared in that moment than I actually was. And I'm standing at the door, and my kids are down the hallway, and I'm like, okay, this is it. This is my moment. I got to do whatever it takes to keep my family safe, okay? And so I'm hold my breath, and I listen. And there's nothing. So I go, Kasha, what did you hear? And there's no response. So I'll go, Kasha, what did you? And I turn around, and she is fast asleep. Just out cold. To this day, she would say, I have no recollection of that ever happening. So that's fun. So I got back in bed, and I'm angry, okay, at this point. And I'm thinking, well, I'm glad one of us is awake. And then I got thinking, okay, maybe she did hear something, but she was in a sleeping mode. And so maybe I should just sit up for the next 90 minutes, hyper-analyzing every small noise. I was terrified. She's dozing, just like a baby. Okay, here's my point. Scared people don't sleep. Scared people don't sleep. There is a storm that is threatening to break apart the boat. That's a wild storm. And Jonah is out cold. See, he's sleeping, I'm convinced, not because he didn't think there was any danger, but he just didn't care anymore. He just didn't care. He was willing to let the ship sink, if that's what it took, to keep from doing what God was asking him to do. But Jonah was not the only one in danger from the storm that he had invited, was he? And this leads us on to the second thing that is true about storms, and that is that they cause collateral damage. Storms, many of you know this, don't just affect us, do they? They affect the people around us too. The storm that came after Jonah cost the people around him a lot. It cost them their cargo, it nearly cost them their ship, and it almost cost them their lives. But they wanted a money-back guarantee on this particular passenger. Right? Storms of disobedience often cause collateral damage to the people around us. Raise your hand, I'm just curious, have you experienced that? Have you watched somebody in your life make a poor decision and then just shrapnel affect the people around them, right? We don't live on an island, do we? For some of us, we have been that person who has brought on the storm that has affected our friends and family. I know I've been in that spot. As a follower of Jesus, collateral damage brought on by Christians, especially when that damage is done in the name of Jesus, that is so hard to watch. It's so hard to bear. And I just want to say to those of you in the room or tuning in today who are not following Jesus and watching some of this happen in the church and around the church, and you may be wondering, how is it that the church can stand by all of the wicked things that Christians have done over the centuries, or even over the last few years? When we make the news, it's not usually great. Am I right? So you may be wondering, how is it that the church can just stand by all of that? And the answer is, at least here at the Bridge, is we don't. We don't. It's not okay. The reality is the church is filled with Jonahs. There are people who've experienced, encountered God. Sometimes there are people who've been sent by God to do something, but who still have messy hearts and who still sometimes choose flagrant disobedience. And when that happens, God is not afraid to send storms on his own people, even when that means that Christians and sometimes whole churches are left standing out in the rain. In verse 10, these sailors, they see Jonah's disobedience and they look at the storm and they ask him a question. They say, "What have you done?" It's an indictment against Jonah. They're calling him out. And it's a fair indictment. It is a fair question. It's a fair question for Jonah. It's a fair critique for Christians and churches today who behave inappropriately. And so if you are here today, if you're not a Christian, or maybe you've just experienced some church hurt, right? You've been collateral damage in somebody else's storm that they have brought on. I just want to say this. I am so sorry. I'm so sorry that you've had to go through that. Your pain is legitimate. Your complaint is legitimate. It's not the way it should be. And I'm sorry. The point of the book of Jonah is not that Jonah is the good guy, but rather that those of us who are Jonahs need grace too. The Bible does not shy away from this particular story, as ugly as it is right off the bat, because the Bible has never been about trying to convey the message that there are good guys and bad guys. There are insiders and outsiders. It is all about trying to convey the message that every single one of us has run away from God, and every single one of us is in need of a grace that is scandalous if it is going to mean anything for us. So, today, as you look at your life, is God using a storm to get your attention? Again, maybe you're in a storm right now that's no fault of your own. But maybe, like Jonah, God is using a storm in your life to shake you off of the path that you've been on and lovingly bring you back to him. Might that be the case for you today? Maybe you know exactly what it is that God is drawing your attention to. Maybe you're like, yep, Spirit's got his finger on that. Other times, it takes some reflection. We sit back and we pray, we dialogue and wrestle with God. We say, like David did in Psalm 139, God, search my heart, know me. Right? See, is there any offensive way in me? Reveal that, hold that open-handed before God. Maybe, for some of us, it's a good day to consider how have our storms that we've brought in on our life affected others? How have we caused collateral damage? And maybe this week a good step for you is to reflect, text, call up, meet for coffee with somebody who's been hurt by a storm of yours, and just to say, hey, I recognize my actions hurt you. And I want to own that, and I want to say sorry to you, and I want to ask for your forgiveness. Maybe it's time. So far in Jonah, we have seen a strange assignment, a strange storm, which brings us to the third and final part of our story, a strange solution. Verse 11. The sea was getting rougher and rougher, so they asked him, "What should we do to you to make the storm, the sea, calm down for us?" "Pick me up and throw me into the sea," he replied, "and it will become calm. I know that it is my fault that this great storm has come upon you." Instead, these men did their best to row back to land, but they could not, for the sea had grown even wilder than before. Then they cried out to the Lord, "Please, Lord, do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, for you, Lord, have done as you pleased." Then they took Jonah and threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. At this, the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. As the storm continues to get worse, the sailors ask Jonah another question. And the question is strange because what we'd expect them to ask is maybe, what should we do? But instead they ask, what should we do to you to make the storm calm down for us? It's a strange question. The sailors, they have what you might call a substitutionary instinct. The idea that one person must die if the rest of us are going to live. This is not a Hebrew or even a Christian instinct. This is sort of a human instinct. This is why all of our books and TV shows and movies are filled with it. The one person laying down their life for the many. And Jonah, he doesn't disagree. He says, pick me up and throw me into the sea, and it will become calm. I know that this is my fault, that this great storm has come upon you. Now, at first glance, this looks like the turning point in Jonah's heart, doesn't it? He goes, it's my fault. Take me. I will die for you, right? Is that what's happening? Are we seeing a turn of heart in Jonah? I actually don't think so. See, if we look closer, there appears to be no sorrow in Jonah's voice. In fact, there seems to be almost no emotion in his voice at all. There is no repentance. There's no turning from anything. And as far as his willingness to die, far from being selfless, you could argue that this is actually the height of his disobedience. How much is he unwilling to go to Nineveh? How far is he willing to go to disobey God and what he has told him? He said, I'd rather be tossed overboard. Thank you very much. I would rather die than see my enemies live. Now, contrast Jonah's bigotry with the attitude of the sailors. Even after they realize that Jonah is responsible for the storm, even after they realize throwing Jonah overboard is the solution, we get to go free, they still keep rowing to try to save this man's life. And only after their efforts are useless do they finally give in. They finally cry out to God just before they do. Remember, they're praying not to their pagan gods, but this is Yahweh. This is the God of Israel that they are praying to in this moment. And they say, God, do not hold us accountable for this man's death. Have mercy on us. And then they toss him. And this strange solution works. The storm stops. The sea grows calm. The sailors are safe. And the already strange story of Jonah chapter 1 ends in a way that is totally backwards. It's with the prophet of God sinking to his death while these sailors are rescued. Now, what does this story have to do with us? This is a very old, very strange story, isn't it? So what does it have to do with us in the 21st century? Christians gathered in a church, Bridge Church, on a Sunday morning. This strange story was picked up by another prophet over 700 years later. Jesus arrived on the scene, and when he did, he said that the people would be given the sign of Jonah. And in the same breath, he said, but something greater than Jonah is here. So what did Jesus mean? What is he talking about? Well, like Jonah, Jesus was sent on a strange assignment, was he not? Like Jonah, Jesus left the comforts of home to go on a journey. Like Jonah, Jesus stood up in the midst of a storm and said, blame me. Like Jonah, Jesus stood in as our substitute, willingly being cast into death so that the sea might be calm for us. But unlike Jonah, Jesus embraced death not to keep his enemies far off, but rather to bring his enemies near. Jesus said he came to give the sign of Jonah because the story of Jonah is the story in which we all find ourselves. We are stuck in a storm of our own making. We are unable to stop the waves or swim to safety. We need help. We need rescue. We need somebody to stand in our place so that we might live. And that, friends, is the story that Jesus entered into. That is the strange assignment that he embraced. And the cross is the strange and beautiful solution that he offered for us. So as we wrap up today, a couple things. There's some of you here in the room, watching online, who feel far from God today. And I want to say this story is an invitation to you. The sailors come to Jonah after everything stopped working, and they say, get up, call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us and we will not perish. Maybe he will take notice of us, was their thought. Some of you are wondering, has God cared to take notice of me in the storm in which I find myself? What we know about these sailors is that they didn't know it, but they were already in the crosshairs of God's grace. It was no accident that those sailors were on that boat that day with Jonah. It was no accident that chapter 1 ends with them coming to know the grace and compassion and mercy of the God of the universe. And if you're watching today and you feel caught up in the storms of life, I want to say it's no accident that you're here either. I believe if you're here, God has you here for a reason. And we are so glad you're here. And maybe, like the sailors, you've been trying everything to stop the storms, and nothing is working. The old tricks aren't working. Maybe, could it be possible that God is using a storm in your life to get your attention because he loves you? He's trying to get you off the track that you're on and on the track that leads to grace and redemption and forgiveness. He's getting you on the track to Jesus, the greater Jonah, the one that your heart is actually most longing for. Could it be today is the turning point in your journey? The interesting thing about chapter 1 is that if there's anybody to imitate, it's not Jonah, it's not the prophet of God, it's these sailors. They show humility. They encounter this God. They see his wonderful power. They say, my goodness, he is worth everything. They forsake the gods, they make sacrifices, and they swear allegiance to him. And so maybe an application, never thought I would say this from stage in my church. Maybe your application today is to start swearing like sailors. This church is full of people who've sworn like sailors, people who've come out of whatever background and encountered the living of God and said, I'm gonna swear allegiance to him because he's given everything for me. So we've got a webpage available. It's a webpage that I had to ask for this last week. It's bridge.tv/swear like a sailor. That's a strange request, but it's a strange book, right? If that's you, if you're feeling like I've been an outsider, but God's doing something in my heart, and I want to explore what it's like to follow Jesus, you can go here, let us know who you are, drop a note. We will follow up with you this week. We will come alongside you. We will pray with you. We will welcome you into the family of God. If you are instead feeling more like a Jonah today, you're feeling like you are drowning in the wake of some bad decisions that you have made, and you're feeling like I'm at the end of my rope. If we know anything about the story so far, it's that God redeems in ways that are strange and surprising, doesn't he? The story could have ended here, with Jonah sinking to his death, a death that he deserved, for sure. But if we know anything about the God that we serve, it's that where there is death, things tend to come roaring back to life, don't they? Jonah thought that he had sunk too low for God's grace. But as we'll find out in chapter 2, just as God's grace has no boundaries, it also has no bottom. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your profound, strange, scandalous grace and goodness. Thank you that no sailor is too far off, no prophet has sunk too low, that we all stand in need of the grace that you have freely offered at the cross. And so, Jesus, we thank you that you are the Lord of all. King Jesus, we swear allegiance to you. We ask that you would take our life and do whatever. We ask that you would help us to take strange steps of obedience, whatever that might look like, knowing and trusting that you lead us to good places and you are trustworthy. So today we lay our whole life down for you because you have laid your life down for us. Amen.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us on our YouTube channel today. I hope that you felt the welcome home of Christ right through your screen. Here we believe that the gospel is good news worth sharing. So if you'd like to share this stream with your friends and family, you can also subscribe to this channel and you can use @BridgeChurchTN. Also, if you'd like to give, there's a link in the description there you can click and it'll walk you through all the steps. And if you'd like to stay connected with us, you can simply head on over to bridge.tv. Hope to see you again soon.